Hey folks, welcome back. So in recent months, I've been focusing mostly on showing you some of the stuff I've got for Starfleet Battles and Federation Commander and talking a bit about those game systems. However, today I wanted to show you something I've been meaning to pick up for a while, which I've had some great games with recently, and that's a different Starship game called Squadron Strike, or Squadron Strike with an exclamation point. This is by Astra Games, based in the US. You can see here I've got two bits here in physical form. I've got the deluxe edition of the core box of the game, and I've got the Squadron Strike Traveler Supplement, which is very cool if you're aware of and play the role-playing game. Now, the difference with Squadron Strike as compared to Federation Commander or Starfleet Battles is really in the main that it's a three-dimensional game. Now, you might think that that is sort of needlessly complicated or very difficult to kind of adjudicate and play, but the genius of the system at play in Squadron Strike is that working in three dimensions is actually surprisingly easy. Now, one thing I'll say at the outset is that the games I've played so far have been online via the Astra Games Discord. I'll put a link to that in the description. And I highly, highly recommend going in there and signing up for a tutorial game, which are happening regularly for Squadron Strike and for the related systems offered by Astra, including Attack Vector Tactical and some other stuff. Now, I do also have AVT, or Attack Vector Tactical, which is a more complex three-dimensional Starship combat game, but I'll show that off in a later video as well. Squadron Strike is an easier point of entry to flying ships in 3D for sure. It also has a highly flexible ship construction system, which is one of the main sort of unique selling points of the game, but we'll get more into that later. So without further ado, let me show you a bit about what's in the box. So you can see here we have, it's a rather tall box, oddly, and the tagline there is any ship, any universe, fully 3D. The Deluxe Edition, as you can see here, just means you get a nice full color rulebook. Now that is pretty handy, actually, I find. It makes the tutorials and stuff easier to read. So there's Astra Games contact info. You can see a little bit of preview of the components that we'll get inside. And we'll just look a bit at how they describe the game themselves. So basically, the cool thing about Squadron Strike, if you're a sci-fi fan, is that you can play pretty decent-sized ship battles in full 3D or in 2D. And you can build ships that pretty accurately reflect combat ships in any sci-fi franchise you can imagine. So that's what they're talking about here with any ship, any weapon, any defense. Pretty much any kind of sci-fi space combat system you can imagine is replicated in this game and can be applied to your ships that you create. So it includes defenses like deflector shields, armor, armor for different components, electronic countermeasures, all kinds of stuff like cloaking devices. Weapons-wise, it's similar. You have everything from pretty massive, hugely terrifying weapons to different kinds of missiles, drones, phasers, all kinds of stuff. And likewise, you have a ship system that can cope with anything from tiny shuttles all the way up to huge super dreadnoughts. So it's enormously flexible in that sense. And again, if you go onto the Astra Discord, there are tutorial sessions about how to use their massive spreadsheet, which is actually how you build ships in the system, and you pair that spreadsheet system with a little bit of extra free software that they have, which will turn them into really nicely formatted PDF ship system diagrams, or SSDs. Now, inside the box itself, just a rather imposing looking black slab here underneath the cover. So we have a few different components which are kind of unique to the game. You can see here we have these height blocks, altitude blocks. So when you're playing on the physical map, you stack these up essentially to indicate the altitude of your ship relative to the other ships on the board. So you have the hex map kind of provides a spatial reference of where your ships are relative to each other. But for altitude, obviously, you can't have like a fully three-dimensional hex grid on your table, so you represent elevation using these stacking tiles, which actually works reasonably well. Then you have these tilt blocks here. So these are very clever. Basically, you have these tilt blocks so that you place these on top of your stacking tiles, and then you can place your ship miniature, which come in the box in the form of sort of papercraft models, which you'll see in a minute. And the tilt block allows you to represent different orientations of the ship in space, because you can do things like rotate, pitch, yaw, full 3D movement. So you can represent that using these tilt blocks combined with noting the location using these stacking tiles, and then you can accurately represent where your ship is in 3D space relative to each other. It also comes with a bunch of D10s. These are the main dice that you use in the game. You see they've included 3 different colors here, and that's so basically you can combine different rolls into a single roll. So, rolling like hit, location, damage at the same time, that sort of stuff, which is very convenient. All right. You can see that these bags have not been ripped open because, again, I've only played this online so far. I haven't found a physical opponent, but I hope to do that at some point. Now we have the Deluxe Edition rulebook. You can see, again, it's replicating the nice cover from the front. On the back, we have a giant-sized version of this range table here, but we won't worry about that for the time being. And also, there is a product code. I guess you could try to register that if you want, but I've already done that, so it shouldn't work. Each box product comes with a product code that you can register online to get all the ship creation tools. And it used to be that buying the PDF version on DriveThruRPG or Wargame Vault would not give you such a code, but I believe that's now being changed. So if you buy the PDF version, you will get a registration code as well. Now, the rulebook is pretty chunky, but you can see it's about 135 pages, I think. Nowhere near as chunky as the Starfleet Battles, 400-page master rulebook. But still, there's quite a lot going on here. But the good thing about it is it's highly readable, written in more straightforward language than the Starfleet Battles rulebook. Everything is nicely noted out for you in the contents here, so you know exactly where you need to look for different specific situations. And you don't need all the rules at once because the rules that you will need will depend on what kind of ship and weapon and defensive traits you're using in your battle, right? So you will build your ships. Say if they're modeled like Star Trek, then you'll need to know about how deflector shields work, different kinds of beam weapons, etc. But a lot of other things will not affect you. You won't need to know about, different unusual defenses or electronic countermeasures kind of stuff if you're just, making ships based on Star Trek TNG or something like that. So it's not a rule book that needs to be digested all at once. Now, what's very handy here, first of all, there's the online services. So it tells you where you can find the forums, social media, etc. But again, the Discord server is really the place to go. Ken Burnside, the designer of the game, also runs a Patreon. For $5 a month, you can get sort of new ships that he's developed and get access to playtest files. He's also written some very useful stuff on game design. He's got a great handbook coming out on designing game worlds for Squadron Strike, which I highly recommend once that comes out. There's some basic stuff here about the organization of the rulebook. And then there's an outline of the basic sequence of play, which is always the best way to start any kind of wargame rulebook. And there's the sequence of play laid out here for you. Now, one thing to note is that there are different so-called modes in Squadron Strike. So you can play Mode 0, Mode 1, or Mode 2, and that basically correlates to how many of Newton's laws are obeyed by those ships. So if you have a Mode 0 ship, it can kind of move any which way it likes, like a UFO or something. And as you get towards Mode 2, you get more realistic kinds of dealing with vectored thrust and stuff like that. So depending on the level of accuracy you want to real physics, you can change the mode of play that you're going to use. It also explains the ship system displays, but we'll look at that ourselves in a minute. The sort of combat choices in Squadron Strike are made using action points. So it's kind of like energy allocation in SFB or something like that. But it kind of models a mix of energy allocating power and just general command abilities on the ship. If you don't use your APs in a given turn, they'll disappear at the end of the turn. And you can't store them for next turn unless you have certain kinds of weapons with capacitors. Your APs are generated by the bridge boxes and stuff on your ship. So if you get invaded by ground forces on your ship, or you get those bridge boxes destroyed, you can actually start to lose access to your action points. Then again, we have some details about different expenditures for AP, including when you're plotting movement. So AP will be spent on movement to do things like adding more thrust to your ship, making a turn or a pivot, changing your position in 3D space. You can also spend it on defensive measures like electronic countermeasures or countermeasures, activating armor and stuff like that, or to reinforce your shields. And then weapons, of course. When you want to fire weapons, you need to use AP for that. A lot of stronger weapons have a cooldown period, so on the SSD, you'll just kind of mark a box to say it's on cooldown for the next turn or whatever. and some weapons then will require cooldown plus AP spend, but it depends on the weapons in particular. And of course, some weapons have even longer arming cycles, so it goes into a little bit of detail about that here. But basically, managing your action points is super important because you need to think about how you're going to plot your movement with the points you have available and still have enough to activate any defenses that you need or to take opportunistic offensive shots if you can line up a good firing solution. Then we have some stuff about crew actions. So this game is interesting as well in that you have damage control crews that work on the ship, and they have a physical location, basically. So at the end of your turn, you can do the damage control where those parties can try to repair systems on your ship. However, if they fail, that system blows up forever, so there's a bit of a risk involved. But when it's a really key system that you would like to get back in action, it'll be worth it to use your damage control parties. Of course, if the location in which your damage control party lives is hit, then there's a risk they'll be destroyed. And another important part of the game is these crew actions, but also what's called your crew rate. So your crew have a rating which correlates to what you need to roll on a D10 to pass your crew rate checks. And crew rate checks will be required for certain types of actions during a turn, and for things like checking if your crew survives when their location is blown up and stuff like that. So your crew can range from legendary at the higher end to hopeless. So hopeless crew, you need to roll a 10 plus on a D10, so not so great. Legendary crew, they almost always are going to pass their crew rate checks because you just need a 2 plus. Crew rates can change. Here it talks about how you can move crew around. And now here's the explanations about the movement cards. I won't go too much into detail about this because, frankly, it's just a lot of information to try and absorb visually. I think, I had trouble really understanding how to play this game until I went on the Discord and got into a tutorial and used their online system to play, which is really, really well done, by the way. And very accurately make sure you follow the rules in the correct order in the sequence of play. And after a few turns of that, I suddenly got it, if you like. And I think that's really the way to go. You need a tutorial to kind of get over the conceptual roadblocks of flying in 3D. Now, the play aids that are in the box are ingeniously designed to facilitate 3D play face-to-face. But for a first go, I think getting on the Discord and, use the same components in the online implementation that you would use in physical play. So it's teaching you good habits as well that you can then take to your face-to-face games. So you've got nothing to lose by learning from the online implementation because it will function identically, essentially, to how you play on the gaming table. Then it explains the Avid Assistant. So this is basically how you work out where your ship is pointing in space, and you can see it kind of laid out for you here. So the Avid is kind of like a flattened out version of a sphere encompassing your whole ship. And then you are intended to use these different symbols here to indicate where different parts of your ship are facing. So, your port and starboard sides have greater and less than signs. The triangle represents the nose of the ship, and the semicircle represents the rear of the ship. And when you put those on the Avid as you play, and as you do pivots and move and so forth, you'll be able to keep track of where your ship is pointing, which is very useful when you need to figure out where you're going to fire. And here's an example, right? So, the top of the ship is here. We've got the nose over there. The left and right sides here, and the rear there. So now we can work out where the ship is pointing in 3D space. And if we want to plot a move, we can just kind of draw a line to where the nose of the ship will go. And then the next turn, or in the next phase after the movement is completed, we can then rotate the ship to reflect that. So again, it's a lot to kind of try and understand from just looking at the rulebook, but when you do it in play, you'll really see that it's amazing how quickly you'll start to grasp what you can do. Now, you also use mid-turn marker placement to sort of guide where your ship will be in the middle of the turn, depending on your direction of thrust and your pivots and so forth. Now here's a great couple pages of examples of doing pivots and rolls. So this is really helping you to take advantage of the three-dimensional nature of the game. Using pivots and rolls correctly can open up some really interesting tactics. And some people who are fans of traditional two-dimensional space games will say that, 3D doesn't add anything, because you're just in this empty void of space and it won't change your tactics, blah, blah, blah. But if you play a couple of games of this against somebody who knows what they're doing, and you'll see how wrong that is. I've had numerous exciting turns play out very differently than they would have in any other game, because I used three-dimensional play to, dodge my way over an opponent, tuck away a vulnerable side of the ship and do some exciting stuff with movements and pivots. And you just simply can't do that in the 2D game. So definitely it opens up lots of new options tactically. Again, here we have some more examples of more advanced pivots, doing things like inverting the ship, combining pivots and rolls. So we're getting to more advanced concepts here. Then here we talk about movement. So we have the vertical plotting grid and horizontal plotting grids. So when you're kind of moving along the hex map itself, you will use these grids to work out your movement across space. Previously, we've just been talking about moving the orientation of the ship, and now we're getting into the actual movement of the ship through the hex map. Again, we have some nice examples here, and we talk about the different movement modes, and that's noted on the hit location 10 of the SSD, by the way, if you're not sure. Then we talk about mode 1 movement, so then we have to worry about thrust and end of turn positioning and stuff like that, and bleeding speed from pivots and so forth. So mode 1 is kind of if you want to play with ships that, like in Star Trek or Star Wars, where they seem to oddly behave like atmospheric craft even though they're in space. So when you turn, you kind of bleed off some speed. You don't, your thrust kind of moves with you. You don't you can't drift at a different angle than where your thrust is pointing, that kind of stuff. Mode 2, you can do all those things. And again, there's loads of nice helpful examples here about how mode 1 movement really works. Then we get into the more advanced stuff with mode 2, and also things like mode 2 torpedo movement. So torpedoes are like drones in SFB. They are seeking weapons that travel separately across the map and can be very damaging. And again, here we have some examples of movement in mode 2 and consolidating different movement vectors together. And a nice discussion of how the different modes compare to each other. All throughout the rulebook, by the way, there are loads of cool little sidebars here about optional rules, reasons why some rules were included or not included. Really, really helpful. So when you're reading through the rulebook, definitely check out the sidebars. Now we have some really in-depth examples for mode 0 movement, including kind of three-dimensional renderings of the ship within its avid ball, which again is really, really helpful. It helps you understand how the 2D play aids show you what's happening in 3D. And we have a mode 1 example as well. Another mode 1 example, because we're getting more detailed and a little bit more difficult to handle than mode 0. Then we get into mode 2. Exciting stuff, and you can see, talking about the plotting phase as a whole, how you plot your movement, try and use your thrust to get to where you need to be or where you want to be. And the interesting thing about this game is that you can sometimes, you set your thrust, you think you know where your ship's going to end up, and you can be a little bit off when you actually work out where you're going to be, which is quite interesting. But as you play more, you'll get better at actually tuning things right in your move plot so that you can get to where you want to be more accurately. Then we get into the combat phase where we're shooting at stuff. Now, one of the things that you should do when doing combat in Squadron Strike is get into a habit of writing things down. Again, the online client does a good job of kind of forcing you into this habit. So you basically work out what action points you have to spend, what weapons you can fire, who the target is, which part of that enemy ship is in arc, or can you fire at the nose? If you hit them, where is that shot going to go, basically. And then when you actually execute the fire, you've got everything all written out, and you can just go down through the list. Basically, it sounds tedious, but actually doing that massively speeds up the resolution of combat. And there's explanations of the firing arcs, which of course are in 3 dimensions, which again adds a unique element to this game. So, if the enemy ship is not in one of the avid windows marked out by your firing arc, then that weapon can't bear on it and you can't fire at it. So you really have to think about the 3-dimensional positioning of your ship and also how you're oriented relative to your target, because that can massively affect which weapons you can bear on the target. And then it explains how to shoot a bearing. Of course, again, we have wonderful full color examples, making life easier for you. And yeah, we're up to 5 examples, 6, 7. So really, there's tons of info in here to get you off the ground, even if you don't have access to a tutorial. But now that you have the Discord and you have their analog space combat by internet client available for free, I mean, there's really no reason not to just go on the Discord and do the online tutorial with somebody who knows. And I guarantee you'll be fascinated by the result. I found it pretty incredible how quickly I was able to adjust to three-dimensional thinking. Not to say that I'm great at the game by any means, but I have pulled out a couple of victories against the players I've been playing against, which has been very satisfying because it takes a lot of thought to actually survive battles in 3 dimensions. So then we get into stuff like hit location rolls, which is a little bit more kind of counterintuitive in a way in this game than in something like Federation Commander, because you don't have like a ship diagram with boxes that you just cross off. It works a little bit more abstractly, but it does replicate the same kind of dynamic where, you know, ships gradually degrade in their functionality as they get damaged, and different types of locations are more critical than others. And basically what you want to do is blow up enough ship locations on your opponent that you start punching through to their underlying structure. And each ship has a structural integrity track that once it's full, the ship will explode. So that's the goal when you're in combat. Lots of examples here of different kind of weapon tables. So for example, we have swarm missiles here, and it's similar to how you would deal with weapons in, say, Federation Commander. You look at the range to your target in terms of hexes. Then you have an accuracy number that you have to roll on your dice. If you hit, you'll do the amount of damage in the damage column. And then there's also a penetration value for when you're dealing with armor and stuff like that. And then weapons have different properties. So you can see the defensive laser has an interceptor property. That means that you can apply these interceptor points to incoming small craft and missiles to try and shoot them down. And it's actually a really elegant system. Basically, if you have a bunch of defensive weapons with the interceptor quality, you can kind of pool their points together and apply them any which way to incoming drones or small craft. And you don't do individual kind of shots in the same way that you would in Starfleet battles, for example. So it just speeds things up a little bit, and it makes defensive fire really quick to allocate in comparison. So then we have lots of info here about weapon traits, the limitations of different kinds of mounts, electronic countermeasures and other stuff that affects your accuracy, cloaking devices, which of course are useful, but have their own drawbacks for the offensive side of things. Then we have some helpful tables for rolling large salvos, which helps, again, speed up combat when you're dealing with lots of weapons going off at once. And then we have your ship defenses. You can see examples here of how shield diagrams are laid out on an SSD. And of course, because the game is so flexible, you have many different types of shields. Burst mode, deflectors, ablative shields, shield regenerators, make them more survivable. Then you have armor, component armor. Then there's the procedure here for damage allocation. So again, you can kind of destroy your different boxes on the ship's SSD. A given ship will be broken down into 10 hit locations. And each of those hit locations has groups of boxes in it. And, you know, the different symbols in those boxes will tell you what kind of box is present, like if it's a weapon or stuff like that. You also have a unique mechanic of hull replacement. So if you take a point of damage that you would rather, you know, that the phaser or whatever survives till the next turn, you can substitute a hull box once per strike, basically, to erase that damage from whatever that specific system is and apply it to a spare hull box. However, weapons with the bursting trait, you can't do that. So, but it's a nice little additional decision-making step that you can do on defense that makes you feel like, you know, you've got a little bit more agency when you're taking loads of withering fire from the opponent. Now we have a lovely full combat phase example here, which again is very helpful, going through each of the shots individually and how they're adjudicated. You know, different kinds of weapons like pulse lasers. Then there's some cool stuff here on unusual defenses, prismatic globes, ebon globes, super science defenses. Now, a lot of these will be recognizable as being inspired by certain sci-fi universes, which if you're familiar with them, you'll be able to pick up quickly the reference. Then we get into missiles, how to avoid them, how to defend against them, how they attack. You can use missile salvo cards to reduce clutter if you don't want to have too many missile counters laying around the hex map. Then you have torpedoes, which can pursue targets for multiple turns. And there's some hidden information aspects about torpedoes, similar to in Starfleet battles. And of course, the torpedoes will behave differently depending on which movement mode you're using. So this nicely explains all of that. There's now some additional traits that can be applied to torpedoes. Again, if you're building your own setting, these can helpfully replicate torpedoes that you may know from other types of sci-fi fiction. Again, we have some details on targeting traits for weapons, how to deal with salvo fire and linked fire, area effect weapons, smart weapons, which don't do friendly fire, interceptors, which we talked about just a moment ago, Aegis weapons, which have multiple firing opportunities on defensive fire, and then miscellaneous other traits, so different things like hold costs, standoff ranges, thrust-seeking, retargeting abilities, multi-penetration, high impact, multi-penetration, double penetration, hurried fire. All these traits really help you be precise about how you replicate cool stuff from your favorite sci-fi universe in the Squadron Strike game engine. Then we can do overloads as well, again, like you would expect to see in FC or SFB. We have devastating weapons, implosion weapons, which can encircle a target, hitting multiple shield facings at once. Multi-hit weapons. Then we have defense-altering traits like ignoring shields, ignoring armor, piercing, ignoring deflection, doing double hits against shields or hull. Crew killing, which is a real nasty one. Then damage allocation changes due to traits, so disabling, raking fire, splitting strikes, slag, that's a nasty one as well. So rather than a box being damaged, which can then be addressed by a damage control party, it's just destroyed straight away. So you can really make some fearsome weapons in this. But again, look to advice from Ken Burnside on how to design fun, playable ships in Squadron Strike. He knows what he's talking about. And again, his book of advice that's coming out soon, I think, will be an excellent resource for those of you who pick up this game. Then we have some weapon limitations. So can't do small targets, can't damage torpedoes, stuff like that. Unreliability, rolling delay, ammunition requirements, avoidable. So if the target maneuvers, you get out of the way, basically. Unusual traits like bubbles, sticky attacks that slow down enemy movement. I mean, there's just incredible amounts of options in here. But again, you can see that a lot of these traits are specialized and will not be applicable to every game by any means. Then we have fighters, which are represented much more abstractly than in FC or SFB. They basically just exist as these little tracks here. As they take damage, you move along the track. When they get to this last point here, they explode. They have there's an explanation here about how to use these attributes for fighters. And explanations of fighter movement, using fighters as escorts, fighter jinking, so trying to evade incoming fire, and how to shoot on fighters, which of course they're smaller targets, so they can be tougher to hit. Fighter attacks, fighter logistics, including where they are stored and how they will park themselves on a carrier. There's also a bit about mecha, so, Japanese-style giant robots as fighters, which are really cool. And it even includes things like, they can land on a ship and do stuff like tear off bits of armor and things, which is really great. Then we have shuttles and assault shuttles, so these are allowing you to do boarding actions. The rulebook makes special note that this is kind of a ridiculous concept in reality. Nobody would really try to do this in a real space battle, but it is frequently appearing in the sci-fi world, so it's something that the game allows you to do. And so you have also the possibility of transporters, assault shuttles carrying boarding parties, and then it explains how to do boarding party combat and capture enemy ships. Then we get into damage control parties as well here. And then we deal with ship ammunition, damage to weapons, fully cloaked ships, in other words, ships that kind of disappear from the map and have to be done using hidden movement. I mean, really, you can do anything you can imagine with this game system as far as constructing your own ships. Now, of course, that does add a degree of kind of player investment, right? If you buy this, you do get some ships in the box as kind of examples, but to really enjoy it to the maximum, you want to either buy the additional kind of supplements that are offered by Astra, such as the squad or the Traveler one that I can show you, or you need to construct your own campaign world. And there is, lots of tools, as I said, to enable you to do that, but it does require some time and effort on your part. But it's also a lot of fun. So, and then we have information about tractor beams, which are always troublesome. You have to work out, who's moving faster than whom and how momentum gets transferred and so forth. So yeah, tractors, same as with SFB, they are a little bit difficult to deal with at times, depending on the tactical situation. Then we have tactical teleporters, cargo depletion, material conditions. Then we have some stuff about scenario setup. So again, as with any space game, scenarios are really where the fun lies. I mean, once you have your ships ready to go, just putting a few of them on an empty map is not always the most exciting thing in the world, but having terrain, fixed installations to fight over, that can really focus the scenario and make things a lot more interesting, more tactically sort of fulfilling for players. Then we have some useful designer notes in the back. And this is the second edition of the game, by the way, so it talks a bit about what they revised from the first edition. So yeah, that is a detailed look at the rulebook. So again, there's a hell of a lot you can do in this game. If you're interested in space combat, you can do a lot worse than picking this up. Now here we have the Empire Directorate War. So actually these two volumes together are kind of a sort of basic setting to get you up and playing. So here we have some scenarios, and here we have a campaign, right? So right off the bat you have some ingredients to sort of focus your attention and get yourself playing on some meaningful and interesting scenarios. So here we have the details about the campaign. So the Empire Directorate War uses Mode 1 movement. There's some tutorial scenarios here. These are really helpful for the new starter, and it kind of walks you through how to use the tutorial scenarios in learning the game, and kind of condensed reminder of the rules, including plotting fire, firing weapons, etc. So yeah, the box set has really kind of put a lot of effort into sort of onboarding new players. I mean, you can see from the number of tutorials and examples in the rulebook, now we have tutorial scenarios here. They really are concerned with making sure that people who buy this box will actually make use of it. Now here we have a campaign. See, there's a campaign map here. So this is a map of the type used for Stars at War. So there also is going to be a more comprehensive campaign system that will be coming out for Squadron Strike, and when you pair that with this game, you'll really be able to go from nothing to having a full-on, proper long-term campaign with multiple factions, all with their own ships and specially designed weapons and so forth. And you won't need to be an expert in the game engine to do so, because they've made all these wonderful tools for you to use. So, I mean, really not much to show you on the camera with this. It's just a bunch of scenarios, basically. But yeah, instead, it's more enticing to look at the SSD book here. Now, we only have a few ships in the box. Again, this is really kind of just to get you started, but you'll see that because of the detail and the three-dimensional aspect of this game, you don't really need a lot of ships to give you that tactical variety, because actually just mastering the nature of 3D movement and how these different ships handle is really exciting and fulfilling on its own. So just having these dozen or so ships is more than enough to give you a feel for things. So this is a typical SSD here. You can see we have a top-down view of the ship, which shows you the shield boxes on the 4 arcs here, which is the horizontal axes of the ship. And then this is a side view of the ship, so we can see the top and bottom shield facings. Note that the top and bottom shields are weaker than the shields around the side and the front and rear. So, this is a kind of vulnerable area to be shot at. Then we see the three-dimensional arcs for each of the weapons. We see our 10 hit locations, so you can see that a lot of them just have some cargo and hull boxes, but then certain hit locations control specialist systems like damage control, the faster than light drive, the shield regenerator, pivot. So if you get hit in this pivot mechanism, your ability to pivot on a given turn will be reduced. You'll only be able to move a certain number of windows on the AVID. The same with roll. And with movement, it actually reduces the amount of thrust that you can do, basically. And these triangles here on a hit location indicate that there's a weapon mount in that spot. And obviously, if you take damage to that weapon mount, then it'll be disabled. And then finally, you have your structural integrity track here, which is 10 in this case. And if that fills up with damage, then the ship will be destroyed. And then we have, finally, our weapon charts here. So this ship has a phased array emitter, which is also an interceptor, so you can use that on defensive fire. You can see it's got a range topping out at 15. Not a whole lot of damage, but at least close in it hits pretty well. Then we have the proton cannon, which does not have interceptor, and it needs a cooldown turn. Again, has a range of 15, a little bit tougher to hit with, but the damage is significantly better, as well as the penetration. And finally, we have twin missiles. These have bursting, which, as I mentioned before, means that you can't do things like your hull substitution to get out from under a potentially terrifying specialist system being destroyed. So yeah, these different kinds of weapons, you can already start to imagine how you might try to handle this ship in combat. Notably, these tutorial ships also have a two-dimensional version. So the two-dimensional SSD is much the same, except that you only have these 4 shield facings. You don't worry about top and bottom shields, obviously, and your weapon arcs as well are just two-dimensional and not 3D. So it's really easy, actually, to start with 2D in this system. There's not a lot of conceptual roadblocks in your way, but when you move up to 3D, there is obviously that additional complexity of thinking about pivots and rotations and so forth. Now here we have the the Paloma FG. So here we have just phased array emitters and twin missiles. Doesn't have the heavier weapons of the previous ship. And this is a 2-up SSD. We've got 2 ships here. Since they are smaller, they're able to fit 2 on the same sheet. Then we have a Dreadnought up here in 2 dimensions, and the much more interesting 3-dimensional version. You can see it's got a hell of a lot more shield boxes on all sides, and it doesn't have that obvious weakness on the top and bottom either. It also has much greater structural integrity with 15 boxes instead of 5. In general, it has many more hull and cargo boxes to absorb hits. And it also has a extended range proton cannon. You can see that it goes out to 19 hexes instead of 15. And yeah, more weapon mounts as well. So certainly worthy of the name Dreadnought. Now here we have a light cruiser, the Rio de Janeiro. Again, we can fit 2 on an SSD with this. And yeah, you can see clearly that it's less robust than the Dreadnought. And again, we're dealing with these 3 basic weapons that are kind of in this starter setting. Next up, we have, I guess that's the Strike Cruiser, CS. This one has the extended proton cannon, which is a nice addition. It's beefier than the light cruiser, certainly, and the frigates and whatnot, but still bested, obviously, by the Dreadnought, which has significantly more robust defenses. It does, however, have 13 on the SI track, the structural integrity track, which is pretty good. Then we have a CA heavy cruiser with pretty cool silhouette there. You can see that we've got pretty clear weakness of shields in the rear, so you don't want to get shot in the butt with this guy. And now we have some different weapons. This one has nuclear torpedoes. So torpedoes, again, are seeking weapons and are very scary in Squadron Strike. Basically, they can do a ton of damage. This one also does bursting and does double hits to structural integrity, so not great to get hit by this thing. It can slag away a lot of your important systems. And there you go. So there's your nuke torp mount there. That one requires a cooldown turn as well. Then we have, what are these guys? These are destroyers. And we have just phased array emitters and gluon beams. So again, we have the phased array emitters, which are basically phasers, and they have the interceptor quality, so you can use them against incoming small craft and so forth. The gluon beams do not have that, but they have a bit more damage and penetration to them, as well as a longer range in this case, 17 range rather than 15. And their accuracy is pretty good. Damage is not that high, but the accuracy is good, which is a nice thing for the firer. And then we have another dreadnought for the other faction. Really, again, a ton of shield boxes everywhere. It looks pretty scary, actually, the silhouette. I like that. Yeah, and then we have a whole bunch of weapon mounts here. You can see got a number of phaser arrays, 2 nuclear torpedo mounts. Again, looking pretty scary. Don't want to get hit by those. And we have, what is that, 15 again on the SI track. So robust and powerful, plus torpedoes equals run away. Then we have the Wisdom Light Cruiser, again armed with phaser arrays, gluon beams, and nuclear torpedoes. This one has weaker shields on the top and bottom again, as we saw with the Light Cruiser for the other faction. And now we have a Strike Cruiser. Again, I'm assuming that's what CS means based on SFB. Hopefully I haven't messed that up. And yeah, this one has, looks like, yeah, got a nuclear torpedo still. We've got, yeah, 2 nuclear torpedo mounts, looks like, according to our mounts here. A few phasers, and 2 gluon beams as well. So not a bad armament. Then we have the Resolve BS-14, so this is some kind of star base. We have, yeah, are there nuclear torpedoes as well? Yes, there are. There are 2 of those here. Yeah, and quite a few gluon beams, so watch out for those. And pretty decent shields on this guy. And yeah, 174 points, so reasonably robust. Then on the back, we have our master ship chart in 2D and in 3D, so the basic stats you need to know to use any of these guys. And there you go. So you do have some pretty cool stuff right out of the box to play with. And then, as I say, if you go on the Discord, you do the tutorials, you learn about the ship design system. There's an awful lot more you can do with the system. It's basically endless. These are the box miniatures that I alluded to earlier. So these are great. You punch these out, and then they form a kind of a cube type shape, and you use those in your tilt blocks to indicate the direction the ship is facing. It really grounds the game, gives it a nice look physically. Obviously, I haven't used these because I haven't played physically, but you can see that there's one sheet for each of the factions that are in the SSD book there. But in the online implementation, you basically the visual implementation is a 3D rendering of these same tilt blocks, stacking tiles, and these cube miniatures, and it looks great. I mean, it's really easy to work out what's going on by just looking at the board at any given moment. And you can see that they're nicely done, nice and glossy material, not super thick. I mean, it's basically thin, fairly flexible cardboard, but more than enough to get you started. And the ship outlines are well done; they look nice. And the 2 factions, clearly identifiable even from a distance. I mean, they use different colors, totally different kind of ship layouts and silhouettes. As you can see, quite contrasting. Then we have a whole load of laminated play aids, which is really great. Much like I've said with Federation Commander, having things that you can mark up with a marker and not have to print every time is really handy. So we have these reference cards here, which give you everything you really need to remember how to play. So your sequence play, how to do things like intercepts, tractors, boarding party combat, consolidating movement vectors, and large salvo table, crew actions. Then on the other side, you have your range angle lookup table and your horizontal bearings. Some, how to deal with pivots. So really handy reference cards to have. Comes with 2 of those. And then we have a whole bunch of the Avid cards here. So, we've got different colors on either side. So, yeah, you have your Avid globe here, which tells you which way your ship is oriented according to the marks that you put in, as I showed you in the examples before. You have your vertical plotting grid, your horizontal plotting grid, your target bearing, and then you can track different things like your ECM, your the name of the unit, your action point spend, etc. Yeah, and they're really nicely made, very handy to use. I mean, nothing on here is too small. The avids, everything you need to mark is a nice big chunky box. Basically, nothing is super tiny. So yeah, you've got plenty of those to do a decent little battle right from the get-go. And then finally, in the bottom here, we have some hex maps. As usual, my camera setup is too limited to show you the whole thing, so I'll just partially unfold here. You can see it's got some nice imagery in the background there from the Hubble. There's a galaxy over on this side. Hopefully you can kind of see it. Yeah, there you go. All the hexes are numbered, so you can follow through on the tutorials. Yeah, so, nice glossy map sheets, good quality. I've unfolded them and checked them out a few different times and haven't had, some cheaper made map sheets you will get. The fold will start to wear and tear on you pretty quickly, but I haven't had that with these guys. So in general, the component quality is good. I love the laminated components. I think the ship minis are a really cool idea and are very practical for playing in 3D. The rulebook, as you can see, is super comprehensive, and I found it really exciting to read because it really made me understand just how much you can do with this game engine. And given that the inner workings are exposed to us, the players, and you can do things like using the online spreadsheet materials and stuff to create your own SSDs really easily. And there's this great active community of the designers and the players who are there to help you. Really, it might seem daunting at first. I've got this three-dimensional game. I've got to learn that. Then I've got to learn how to design ships. And there's so many traits and qualities in the rule book. But really, just give it a try, and you'll be stunned how quickly you'll pick it up, especially because there are so many great people out there willing to help. So, that is Squadron Strike, the main game. And I think it's a wonderful investment if you have any interest at all in space combat. Which presumably, if you're still watching this channel after all this time, you do have some sort of use for that kind of information. So I highly recommend this game. And it is really different from Federation Commander or Starfleet Battles. And, even just for that reason alone, I think it's worth checking out and seeing if you like it. Because I found that, it doesn't at all diminish my enthusiasm for Starfleet Battles and Federation Commander, but it provides a really unique and singular experience that those games don't offer. So it's such a great addition to my collection. Now, just for a few minutes here, we'll take a quick look at Squadron Strike Traveler. I won't go into a lot of details here because, if you don't know much about Traveler, it may not mean much to you, but just to show you the kind of ship expansions that are available for Squadron Strike and the campaign settings that are on offer. They're really well done, basically. That's what I want to convey to you. They come with everything you need to start jumping into that sci-fi universe. So in the Traveler Folio Edition here, they also have a boxed standalone game, which, you don't need the core box in that case. You can just buy that if you want to play exclusively in the Traveler world. But the Folio Edition is everything that is not in the base box that you need, basically. So this is the most affordable way for me to have both the full Squadron Strike system to use as I like and to have Traveler components as well. You can see you've got 3 sheets of cube miniatures here with classic ships from the Traveler universe, which is very cool. All different sizes as well, and trackers for your end of turn, your ship movements, your salvos, and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not going to go into great detail here, but at some point I'll do a video about the Traveler RPG, and we can refer back to by that point you'll know more about the different factions and what's going on in that universe. But for now, I'm assuming if you're interested at this point in the video, you're probably already interested in Traveler. And here you have a nice reference sheet for weapons of different tech levels. In Traveler, you have this concept of different civilizations or different planets will have different tech levels of weapons that are accessible depending on how much they've developed. So in the Imperium, you have some planets that are as high as tech level 15. So you have those weapons laid out for you here if you want to build ships with tech level 14 or 15 weapons, which is handy. Then you have your ship book, of course, which has quite a lot of stuff, actually. We have a number of ships for the Third Imperium. Again, there is a serial number. Please don't steal. I think I've already registered it, but I'm not sure. This gets you the ship design spreadsheets, and 2D SSD variants for all the 3D ones, and an additional cruiser as well. Now, I'm not going to go page by page with this because there are 64 pages in here, but it's great. Basically, it gives you loads of background, design, and service history for each class of ship. Then, of course, the nicely laid out, easy-to-use SSDs with all the weapon details that you need. We also have some 2D versions and some variants. So this is the Atlantic CA, by the way, a 75,000-ton heavy cruiser. We have a 1,000-ton destroyer, so that's much, much smaller. And thus we have a tiny little silhouette there with a 2-up SSD format, which is handy. We have some variants here with a bit more shield available. Then we have frigates. There you go. Clearly ramping up in power level. And they have small missile launchers, particle beams, and laser turrets. There we go. And we have light cruisers, 30,000 tons, which doesn't sound that light, but comparatively to the bigger cruisers it is. And there's some special notes here for some of the weapons as well. And these have large missiles, which will do more damage than these smaller ones, of course. And let's skip ahead a bit here. So then we have armored cruiser example here. You can see it's got, what is it, 19 SI points on the track, so very robust. A ton of weapon mounts, lots of triangles all over that SSD, so beware is all I can say about that one. Skip ahead a bit more. We have the 14,000 ton CL here, which has a name I cannot pronounce. A perennial problem with Traveller is that a lot of the names for things were generated using different random name generation tools, apparently, so they're not always super pronounceable. You just have to come up with your own thing. So, like, I don't know, what do you say? Vlejdatel class? We'll go with that. Yeah, so it's a strike cruiser. You can see, I mean, there's a ton of different ships in here, each coming in several variants, covering the main factions in the Traveller universe. So a really great way to get off the ground with doing ship battles in Traveller. Now, of course, these ships are significantly bigger than the tiny little ships that your typical adventuring party might use. However, you know, there are campaigns in Traveller where you can fly element class cruisers for the Imperium, for example. So you could potentially do a campaign as a part of a crew of a heavy cruiser and then use Squadron Strike to do your space battles, which I think would be amazing good fun. There's also some advice that Ken's put together about how to have player character actions affect the ongoing battle on the Squadron Strike map, which is pretty cool. Here again we have a Traveller tutorial specific to this folio. So it's a new tutorial intending to use the ships that are available in this package, which is great. Again, really helpful for onboarding new players. I think it's definitely going to be easier to get people to try this with you if you're using a Sci-Fi universe they understand, such as Traveller, or you make up your own version of Star Wars or whatever. So it's really nice to have that they have a license for Traveller stuff that they can use. I think it will help get some people into the game system. So there you go. That is a very quick look at the Traveller folio here. I haven't had a chance to play with this yet. I've been just building my understanding of the basic Squadron Strike system, doing the different matches and tutorials with people online. So I don't want to talk too much about the Traveller folio until I have more of a chance to really mess with it. But I think the quality is great. It's certainly, it's a lot of ships for your money. And it's a great add-on to the main box. And if you buy the folio version, then you're not repeating yourself at all. You're not going to get any, redundant copies of stuff. This is all just purely what you need to add to the core box, and then you've got everything you need for a Traveller. I think this was about $35 or something like that. So you can see it's nice and packed full of stuff. Definitely good value. I did have to pay to ship these guys over from Noble Knight Games in the US, but I was really keen to do this, and eventually finally broke down and paid the high shipping cost. And then I've really enjoyed the game since then. The matches I played online have been a ton of fun. I haven't done the tutorial for the spreadsheet yet, but I will be doing that in a couple of weeks' time at last. So I'll be making ships as well for myself, and I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, it's a great system. The box really does a great job of kind of introducing you to the main concepts of fighting in 3D space. If you want more ships for a recognizable and storied sci-fi universe with a great amount of content for it, the Traveler Folio comes recommended from me. The content that so far, as I've messed with it, looks great. So, yeah, that's Squadron Strike and the Traveler Ship Book 1. Hope that was helpful for you guys. If you got any questions about Squadron Strike and how it feels in play, feel free to ask me in the comments. If you want to see some more about Squadron Strike and maybe some tutorial stuff, I can point you to some really good videos that are out there in the description as well. But if you want me to cover the system some more in future videos, let me know, and I'll see what I can do in that direction also. In the meantime, as always, I hope you are staying safe, healthy, happy, and well. Let me know what you thought of the video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. All right, take care, and bye-bye.